Yeah.
Okay, great. I think we're ready. Hey everyone, welcome to the first Passion Talks workshop. My name is Eugene, and I'm one of the directors for Passion Talks. The other director is Asha. Asha, if you want to say hi really quick.
Hello.
Okay, awesome. So before we get started with Matt and EdTech, I just wanted to give a little introduction about what Passion Talks is and like the inspiration and goals that led up to it. So Passion Talks is a series of independent workshops that we're going to hold where each time we're inviting someone who is really interested about a particular topic in tech, and they're going to give like a practical introduction. So they'll walk us through like real life use cases and also like what it's like to work in the field. So the goal of Passion Talks first and foremost is to showcase passions. We wanted to provide a platform where people are able to talk about something that they're really excited about and they want to share to more people. Something I've found is that I really enjoy listening to other people talk about something that they're passionate about, because then they just like go on, and when they're excited about it, I get excited about it. And I've always wondered why there wasn't some sort of like platform where they could reach a wider audience and talk about this more. So that's exactly what we're trying to aim for here with Passion Talks. We're trying to reach this like mutual benefit where they're able to reach a wider audience while they're also able to translate their energy into like creating a really memorable like presentation for you guys. On top of that, we really wanted to demonstrate the creative applications of tech. So one thing that tech really benefits from is that it has like a lot of applications in a lot of different areas. And that's not just like the ones that people immediately think about. This is also places like biology and like art and relevant to today's workshop, like education. And all of these like different topics are like just as important, or if not more, and they need like the exposure that the other ones get as well. And hopefully by like these workshops, we want to like expose to you like things that are not necessarily that you might think about in tech, but like you have like a wider range of like knowledge after this. And we just want to like celebrate all of these different applications. And finally, we want to inspire you. We just want to hopefully give you an idea of what is possible with tech. If you are currently uncertain about like how to apply your knowledge in tech, we hopefully will give you some like concrete ideas like through these different workshops. Like hopefully you come out thinking, oh, like I didn't know that was possible, but since I know now, like this is definitely something I want to look more into in the future. And on the flip side, you might know like everything there is like about tech and what you can do, but because of that, you're like overwhelmed by like all this sensory input and you don't know what to like narrow down on. So for you guys, we hope that you get some more knowledge of like practical use cases of particular ones, so you can like figure out what exactly appeals to you. But regardless of what your situation is, we hope that the biggest takeaway for you is that you come out of this more knowledgeable. Using Passion Talks, we hope you get like to know what is out there and what you can find in like yourself to be your own passion or interest, and like hopefully you can make more educated decisions about that. So yeah, Matt, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So in case you wanted to get points for coming today, this is the attendance code. It is teach, and the A is silent, so it's tech.
Wait, so does that mean that the code is like you type out
Yeah,
the
parentheses
parens as well?
included.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't know already, ACM has a point system. So if you're an ACM, any member can join. So you don't have to be like a registered member or an officer. You can get points for attending events. And then if you get a lot of points, you win things. And in the past, I don't know, people have won what? I don't even know exactly, like expensive tech stuff, like Facebook laptop power backpacks, I think was one of the things that people won. A smart speaker or something like that. Amazon Alexas. Look at all these money things that you can win. You know, we're broke college students. You need everything we can get. And I believe that since we are remote, we will ship them to you, ? But I have no idea. John, sorry about that. But yes, please get points. They'll try to get you them in the hot fall. What's a better way to come back home to UCLA than a free Google Home? Think about that.
I can't think of anything. Okay, but without further ado, let's give it up for Matt and EdTech.
Thank you, Eugene, for the introduction. Again, please follow him on YouTube, watch that video. But yeah, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about education. First, I think almost all of you already personally know me. That's just kind of how these kinds of events sometimes work out. But I'll give you a quick introduction to who I am, because you're going to hear me talk for the next hour and a half. So at least you should know a few things about me. So my name is Matt. I'm one of the many Matt Wangs at UCLA. That photo is taken of me at a career fair where a recruiter told me that they had already met another Matthew Wang at UCLA, who's a CS major. But that's just the life I live. I'm a second year CS and math econ double major. And the reason that I picked that is because I'm really passionate about empowering people with computers. And what exactly does that mean? So I'm not super particularly interested in working on like the quant or finance side of CS and math econ, but rather I love economics because it talks about how we can empower people, how we can uplift people out of poverty, how we can create win-win situations and incentivize people, companies, governments, anyone to help each other. As a quick plug, I am the president of ACM Teach LA, which is one of the 8 subcommittees of ACM. And the big thing that we do is we try to bridge the gap in education inequality in LA by providing free computer science classes, curriculum, and things like that. I promise this is not like a sponsored plug or anything, but I'll talk about Teach LA in a little bit when I go through my experience with education. And unrelated, but I am Canadian. Like Kevin, a lot of great CS people, I think, or mediocre CS people come from Canada. And I'll talk a little bit about what I've done in the Canadian education system and kind of how that has a little bit of a difference with how America runs things. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. No one really cares, so we'll kind of move on. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview about what this passion talk is going to look like. So first, I recognize that this is on Zoom and online, which is not the most engaging format. So overall, if you ever want to comment, ask a question or whatever, type it in the chat. I'll see it. As we talk about some companies, please feel free to roast the companies if you've used them before and you're like, wow, this product is terrible. I'd love to hear what you have to say, and I'll try my best to answer anything that you talk about in the chat box. But as for the game plan for today, what am I going to talk about? So first, I'm going to try to sell you that education is important. I hope you already believe that's the case, but if you don't, that's okay. We can still be friends. And then secondly, I'll talk about why EdTech might be a solution to those problems. Then we'll talk about some framing tools. So how can we think of EdTech? How can we think of solutions? And how can we solve these kinds of problems? And then we'll do a bunch of case studies. And that's going to be the meat or beyond meat of this presentation. And we're going to talk about different kinds of companies, how they tackle the problems in education and how successful they are. And I think metricizing them is actually really important because sometimes they're not that successful. Finally, to end it on a positive note, I'll talk about what we can do as students, as members of the UCLA and LA community, but also just as people, how we can interact and impact the education sphere and make sure that everyone gets equal access to education. But yeah, the big overall thing is if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I will try my best to be responsive. And if you have any comments, I'd love to hear what they are. But yeah, without further ado, let's get started. And I think it would be unfair for me to just jump right into EdTech because I'm going to talk about this for a long time, and we should talk about what the problems that we're trying to solve are. So in LA, education is a local problem. So Teach LA mostly works with the LAUSD, which is the school district that covers Los Angeles. And according to the LAUSD themselves, average Black students in the LAUSD in the high school area are 3.1 grades behind the average white student. That is a huge and kind of depressing statistic, right? I don't think that your race or ethnicity at all should affect the kind of education that you receive, but it still happens anyways. If you notice, this is footnoted. I will show you all the references. There are 60 references that each of these stats are footnoted from. I would encourage you to look these up yourselves because just because I'm saying it doesn't mean it's true, but this does seem pretty bad, right? In addition, 35% of LAUSD students are eligible to attend UC or CSU colleges. That's a pretty low number, right? Because if the whole point of this education pipeline, and this is debatable, is to get kids to go from elementary school to middle school to high school and then college, we are clearly failing that because that means only 35% of students can even attend these state schools that are the most accessible for them, right? So clearly something is kind of up in our high school system. And finally, in California, only 42% of pre-K children 42% of pre-K children don't receive preschool at all. And there's a lot of research that shows that pre-K schooling is really important for children's developmental growth, especially when we talk about reading skills. And we'll kind of see how we can work with that in a bit. Yeah, so it's a problem in California, it's a problem in LA, but it's also a problem all across America, right? So I'm going to repeat that same stat that I just brought up earlier. On average in the United States, Black students are 2 to 2.5 grades behind the average white student in America. First of all, that's still pretty bad. Second of all, I think this is very interesting. It's better than the California average. Interesting, right? Because a lot of people view California as this like ultra rich state. It's super liberal and progressive, and we do a great job at catering to minorities. But at least in this specific metric, it doesn't look like that we do. Why is that the case? Unfortunately, I can't tell you the raw, complete answer, but you can think a little bit about how demographics and population distributions affect education in California. I'll also bring up something a little bit later, but I'll quickly bring it up now. In America, property taxes define a lot of how education works. And California is actually the most unequal state in terms of population and tax distribution. So you have some places that have tons of funding for their schools because everyone's parents work for Google. And then you have other places where the average median income is in $20,000 or $30,000 a year, which is clearly not enough to even pay most income taxes. And then the schools are underfunded as a result. In addition, this is just, I think, a very tragic stat. 62% of high schools are harmed by opioid abuse. That just seems terrible. I feel like high schools should not have to deal with this problem, and yet they do. And finally, this is maybe a bit of a political gripe, but we passed this act called No Child Left Behind in 2005, and it's really bad. And I can talk about that online, but I won't because you might get a little bored. But if you have some extra time, I'd encourage you to Google it. The big thing is that it basically just hurts schools that are already performing worse and cuts their budget for being bad, which doesn't make sense because in my opinion, if your school is underperforming, you should support the school more, not cut their budget. But yeah, it's a national problem, but it's also a global problem. And this is the last slide. I'm just going to read stats at you, so I apologize in advance. But according to the UN, 1 in 5 children in the world are just not in school, period. That seems also problematic, right? Because school is a huge part of how we do employment, and making sure that people get access to food and water and basic human rights. And if kids don't have an avenue to do that, that's pretty bad. 617 million students aren't proficient in basic math and reading. So we're not talking about calculus or even exponents or stuff like that. It's basic things like counting, reading books. These things like clearly significantly impact your life from now and beyond. So 617 million, I know it's a big number. It's kind of mentally hard to figure out how many people that actually is, but that is kind of a problem. And finally, according to the UN again, 33% of countries have not reached gender parity in primary education. So I know oftentimes we talk about gender gaps in tech and in higher education, and obviously those are very important. But also on a grander scale, girls aren't even getting access to primary education on an equal rate. And that's problematic because you're never going to get girls into university if they don't even go to primary school. The other thing I just want to point out here, and this is kind of important, is that these problems are different. Right? The problems that California is facing is different from the problems that the United States faces. They're a bit similar, and they're clearly very different from the problems that the rest of the world faces. And so when we look at EdTech and look at education and see how we can solve these problems, we need to think about the audience that we're going to target. Cool. I'm an econ major, kind of. Is math econ even a major? I don't even know. But I want to talk a little bit about economics for a bit. The most common misconception I think people have about economics is that economics is just about money. The parts about economics that are about money make lots of money, but they're not all of economics. To me, I really like economics because it's the study of choice and the study of people and how we make these kinds of choices. And so there are metrics about economics that aren't money related. I'll tell you some anyways. But the big thing that you'll learn in any economics class from your intro high school AP Econ all the way to the PhD graduate level is that economics education is like viewed as an amazing thing, no matter who you are. If you're Milton Friedman, one of the most libertarian, economically right people that there are, he views education as the sole way that you empower human capital. If you want to look at the other end, Karl Marx also views education as a tool to educate the masses and give people ownership over their own lives. And even though those people are very diametrically opposite, they view education as important. And in the middle, you have people like Tony Blair. He was the previous Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And he says on the slide, that education is the best economic policy there is. But I could just be like a TV economist and just say random things and not back them up. But I should back them up, right? So why is education such a good investment? If we care about money, cash rules everything around me. One additional year of education is an insane investment. So macro adjusted, which means you look at like ripple effects and stuff like that, the return on investment is between 9% to 36%. And I know that seems like a large range, which it is. It's very hard to calculate these kinds of things, but that seems relatively accurate. That's the international consensus. The impact on GDP per capita, which basically just means like how many things we make per person, is between 18 to 35%, and it raises the average earnings of a person by 10%. You don't have to know that much about finance, but that's kind of a nuts return on investment. This beats every other normal kind of investment vehicle. Like you might have heard of mutual funds or index funds, bonds, private equity, all these kinds of things. Education beats all of them in terms of investment, which I think is a very telling thing to think about. But also, money isn't everything, right? Education is really important outside of money. It's the #1 way to lower fatality rates for prenatal care, right? And childbirth, which I think is a big deal. And it's not something you'd expect. You probably would expect like more hospitals or things like that are better. But no, it's education. You can check that out. It's a UN statistic. In addition, when you want to combat sexually transmitted infections and other kinds of diseases, education is one of the most important tools there, right? There's a really famous randomized control trial done by the people who won the Nobel Economics Prize last year, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. And in one of these trials, they find that actually education beats giving people condoms to use it to contraceptive use, because it's really important to make sure that people know what these condoms are doing and know how it impacts their lives. And education is really important there as well. And finally, a lot of us are CS majors, so this has kind of been in the back of your mind, I'm sure. But it's a really good way to beat automation, right? According to the World Bank, they view education as the #1 tool in beating automation, because as we automate away different kinds of jobs like agriculture or cashiers or other customer service jobs, education is our only weapon that makes sure that people can still do meaningful things with their lives. If you're like, wow, Matt, that was boring as heck, that's fine. That's the last of the economics section that we're gonna do. But if you really enjoyed that brief crash course on economics, that's not really a crash course on economics, that's a complete lie. If you enjoyed my brief blab on economics, there's a field of economics called development economics that specifically studies these things, and they use applied microeconomics as well. So it's about this thing called human capital. A lot of people won some awards. It's like kind of important. You should check it out if you're interested. But yeah, so clearly, education is good, it's important, but as we just discussed, there's probably not enough of it going around. So we have to solve that problem. But why do we have to do it with tech, right? Why can't we just, I don't know, like print some money and then pay teachers? That's what the Fed's doing right now, right? Well, there are a few ways that we solve problems, right? So one is policy. We can enact laws and we can create bureaus and stuff like that. We can pass things like No Child Left Behind. We can literally just throw money at the problem. We can fund things, or maybe in a nicer way, pay for teachers, right? Pay for resources, pay for schools, pay for gyms, pay for all these different kinds of things. And we can also look to innovate. So my argument here is that you need all three of these things. And currently we have mostly been doing the first two, but not the third. Why have we been doing the first two? Well, to be honest, it's pretty easy to like say, oh, there's a problem, let's pass a law or let's give money to solve it. But forcing innovation, especially in a field that we'll talk about in a bit, is hard to innovate in. It's a little tricky. In addition, just to be a little critical, the US has had some major policy failures in the past few years in related to education. So I just mentioned No Child Left Behind. Again, please Google that if you're interested. But also, a lot of schools are under desegregation orders, including the LAUSD, because they found that school districting policies have just basically forced a bunch of people who are disadvantaged to be together. They have less funding, they receive less resources, and they just get less money, and then their kids are set up to fail, right? I think that's inherently problematic. There's over 160 unified school districts in America that are under desegregation orders. And then finally, the current education secretary, Betsy DeVos, this is the last bit of super political stuff you'll hear from me. She just like doesn't believe in education, so that's great. And then we also have funding, right? So I think a common misconception that people have is that the US is like terrible at funding social programs. This is just factually not true, right? We spend the most per capita, so per person, on healthcare, and we spend the second most on each student out of every single OECD country, which is like the rich country club. So basically every country in the world. So What's up with that, right? Like if we spend all this money, how are we not solving these problems? The US is not the second best in the world for healthcare providing service. It's not the second best in the world for schools. We rank in the bottom 20s for school achievement tests and racial equality tests. And we'll find out that throwing money at the problem is not always the solution. Tim says, yay, school choice. School choice is good. School choice is good. Desegregation orders. But yeah, so I think we need to have both the policy and funding in mind, and I'll tell you later about why tech doesn't solve every single problem in the world. And so because of these failures that we have with policy and funding, and also, I don't know, like some of us have backgrounds in tech, I guess we'll look at education technology. So let's talk a little bit about what that's going to look like, right? This is the biggest framing tool I'm going to use, which is what are the issues in education and how can we solve them? So in all those stats that I brought up earlier that you probably forgot already, there are a few common things, right? So the biggest one is access, right? Do people even have access to schooling? And this is, two-pronged. One is just making sure that everyone gets access to education, right? If 600 million kids don't have access to education, clearly not everyone is getting it. But secondly, we also want to make sure that underserved groups get it, right? And this is probably what we're going to talk about when we look at LA or the United States, because some people get tons of access to education. I'm very lucky that, my parents went all in and I lived in a nice place in Toronto that had a lot of school opportunities for me, but that's not the case for everyone. So kind of two-pronged there. Next is once we get kids in school, how can we make sure that they learn the most from school? I think all of us can probably agree that we've had some pretty bad teachers and we've been turned away from certain subjects because the teacher just wasn't that good. How can we make sure that that doesn't happen and that kids, when they are in school, learn the most and get the most out of what they do? Finally, it's more bureaucracy, is organization, right? Clearly, we spend tons of money on school in America, but somehow it's not turning into results. So how can we make that pipeline more efficient and how can we make it easier to navigate for parents and kids? Some other things, just to, keep in the back of your mind, no pressure if you don't remember them, are going to be just the things that are on this slide, right? Audience, how's your solution targeted? I think when we talk about EdTech, people normally think about kids, right? But can we help teachers? Can we help parents? Can we help school boards and school districts and the government, right? Scale. Is it easily scalable? Does it require like a bunch of people to learn a lot about a specific school or student they work with, which is not necessarily a bad thing? Or is it just, it's a video, anyone can watch it, right? Similarly, how individual is it? Does it treat every student as the same kind of student, or is it more tailored or personalized? And can that be good? Can that be bad? Is it equitable, right? A lot of things are not equitable. If one of the things they want to improve is increasing access to education with technology, we better make sure that it actually does that and doesn't actually shut out groups of people from participating in our discussions. And then how disruptive is it, right? If we're looking at technology that fundamentally changes the education system, you need a lot of buy-in from schools and parents and teachers and stuff like that. But if it just, reinforces existing norms, it might be easier, but also maybe it doesn't solve a root problem. And finally, this is very underrated, but is it easy to use? This is very important, okay? Some things are just hard to use. And if you need to pay a coach to teach you how to use some software, that's a huge barrier. It doesn't matter how good your program is. If teachers can't use it, it's completely useless. And we'll talk about an example later, Blackboard, that is terrible at doing this and the ripple effects that it has on their product. Cool. Okay, so I said some words. They were mostly adjectives and nouns. But let's now move on and talk about some companies that I think are interesting, that we can learn some positive lessons about, like, wow, they're cool, they do good things. And I'll try to slide in like a roastable topic for each case study so that we can also have a bit of a laugh, but also, learn some things and realize that there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room for us to make some change. I'm gonna talk about 4. The first one is classroom digitization. This is probably the most obvious one. The second is teaching tools. So how can we make teaching better? Since this is an ACM hack event, I'm going to talk about teaching tech and CS for a bit. And then finally, I want to end on closing inequality gaps, which I think is probably the hardest problem to solve and the one where there's the most potential for us to make a difference. But yeah, let's get started. And again, as a reminder, if you have any questions, any things you want to slide in, please slide into the public DMs. I'd be glad to answer them and talk to you about it. Yeah, let's first talk about classroom digitization. So that's like, making the classroom digital, moving away from a physical space and physical paper and pencils and making things a lot more efficient. There are a few problems that you can quickly identify from physical classrooms, right? One, you have to physically be in the classroom. That's problematic if, I don't know, there's like a global pandemic and you can't go to class anymore. Secondly, tracking learning is really hard, right? If you're in a physical classroom of 30 kids and you're a teacher, it's very, very tricky for you to figure out exactly what each kid is doing. They're not scalable, right? You can't just like plop another 30 kids into a classroom. That's going to cause a lot of problems in terms of how you teach the kids. And finally, that they're just inefficient. But that's kind of an unsubstantiated claim. You have to kind of talk about that a bit more. And there's some solutions, right? To solve the fact that classrooms are physical, we can make them anywhere. We can use software like Zoom, but also other kinds of software to make sure that classrooms can be anywhere you want. You can add analytics, for example, to make it easier to track kids' learning. And you can make scalable content, right? That you don't have to physically be in a classroom to experience that kind of learning. Efficiency is kind of just like a make it more efficient thing. It's very hand wavy, but we'll see some examples in a moment. I want to first talk about one of my favorite companies in the world, which is Khan Academy. And I don't work for Khan Academy. Khan Academy, y'all want to hire me? I'll take it. But I think they're a really, really good example of an EdTech company done right. So they're founded by this one person. His name's Salman Khan, but he goes by Sal Khan because there's a famous Bollywood actor called Salman Khan. Anyways, not really that important. But the pitch of Khan Academy is that it's free, online, personalized tutoring. And it's very interesting, actually. The story is that Sal Khan wants to teach one of his nephews math or something, and so he just made some videos, and the videos got really popular in his community, and he's like, oh, I should make this a website. And now it has over 100 million users, which is kind of insane in the past 15 years. It's grown a lot as a company. It's a nonprofit. It's a 501c3, has to do with like tax laws. No one cares, boring stuff. And yeah, it's a very interesting company. I'm sure that a lot of you probably have heard about Khan Academy already. I think it has two kinds of impacts, right? The most immediate is access. So a lot of people use Khan Academy and it's free. There's a few good things about Khan Academy, right? One, it's online. You can do the videos anywhere you want in the world. That means that if you don't live close to a school or if, I don't know, there's a global pandemic, it's easier for you to still get the learning that you want. And secondly, it's free. That's insane, right? If you want to learn, advanced calculus or something, short of reading an online and open source textbook, your best bet is probably paulsmathnotes.com or going to school. And that costs money, right? And that costs time, and people don't have that. But Khan Academy offers that to you for free. And I think that's an insane, opening of barriers, makes it easier for people to get the education they want. But also, I think it changes pedagogy too, right? How we teach people. As you'll see, there is a study done in, this is either done in Philadelphia or New York City. I read like 5 papers and I picked one of them. But there's a study done, middle school kids that used Khan Academy were 2 times more likely to meet the state standards for their state on reading in English compared to the control group that just proceeded as normal. So having that reinforcement learning was very helpful. And what does Khan Academy do to help you with that? To some extent, it's personalized now. So now it walks you through some exercises and you do them, and then it gives you feedback on the areas that you need improvement on, right? So for example, if you go through a bunch of algebra stuff and they realize, hey, you're having a problem dividing, variables on both sides of an equation, it can tell you that now. And that's a kind of personalized learning that you don't normally get in the classroom unless your teacher is able to really be on top of everything that's going on. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really, really hard to do that. Khan Academy also gives teachers a lot of tools. You definitely can't see this, but that second screenshot that says Map Accelerator Progress lets teachers view how all of their students are doing in Khan Academy and offers suggestions on how they can do better. Overall, it's a pretty solid company in these current uncertain times, as I'm sure all of you have seen in many emails. They've also provided daily schedules and free remote resources for kids from age 2 to 18. So you can stay at home, bundle up on your couch, and just learn things for the entire day. And anecdotally, a lot of schools that we work with at Teach LA have mentioned that these kinds of resources have been useful for them. So yeah, I have almost nothing negative to say about Khan Academy. The only thing I want to point out is that they kind of have a funding problem. And the reason why is because, as you know, they haven't provided a way to make money. They live entirely off of a charitable foundation that people make donations to. And for now, they've been chilling, enough companies and people donate money to Khan Academy. But it's not super sustainable, right? And especially right now with increased bandwidth and traffic, they're really campaigning for more donations. So the struggle you'll have here, and you'll see in a lot of other EdTech proposals, is that getting funding and making money is very hard. And if you want to make things free that everyone can access, sometimes you won't be able to make that much money. And that scares away a lot of people from investing in the game. Cool. Okay, that was a lot of me talking. Again, it's going to be another hour of that. I apologize in advance. Khan Academy also spun off a lot of different kinds of companies. I'm not really going to go super in depth in these. These are massively online operating courses. It's like World of Warcraft, but for classes. And there's a bunch of them now. And some of them are completely free, like edX, and some of them cost money, like Udemy. But Khan Academy was the first big one that really got this idea in the scene. And now there's a lot of competition. And they partner with universities like UCLA. It's very exciting. Okay, next I want to talk about Duolingo. So this is just a meme. I'm trying to make it hip with the kids. But Duolingo is a company. They make an app. The app helps you learn languages. And the pitch is that it's micro-learning for languages, right? So, you go on the app, you practice Spanish for 15 minutes every day, and then eventually you learn Spanish, and it's very exciting. It's founded by the guy who made the reCAPTCHA thing, like the I'm not a robot tick. So that's a little bit of fun trivia for you. But yeah, how does this work? To some extent, it's kind of like Khan Academy, right? So Duolingo is also free. It's supported by ads. So you can learn languages for free. And normally, you'd have to physically go to a country or pay for a tutor to learn a language. And now you can do it from your phone, or for most users, not really do it from your phone. They have a lot of users. They have 300 million users as of 2018, so that's an old stat. And they have a lot of stuff. So you can learn 23 languages, over 100 plus courses, like Intro Spanish, Advanced Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. I don't know how Spanish works. Maybe I should use Duolingo. But yeah, they have a lot of stuff available for people to use. Also, interestingly, they have a research arm. So they publish AI research on natural language processing. I don't know that much about AI machine learning. I only know enough to teach high schoolers about it. I'm sure John in the audience can tell you more about AI, but they've started giving back to the educational community, basically, with the money that they've made. One thing I'll point out, though, is unlike Khan Academy, that has an array of studies that prove that it's an effective tool and that teachers should use it, Duolingo actually has no long-term academic studies to back it up. No one has been able to make an RCT or something that proves that Duolingo is really, really effective. Because to some extent, this is a great pitch, right? You can learn languages for free. But also, I'm going to be honest with you, I downloaded Duolingo when I was in grade 8, and I said, I'm going to learn Spanish, and I never learned Spanish, and here we are now. And I think something interesting to think about is with these educational technology kind of companies, right? How effective are they actually? We're going to find that a lot of these other companies don't have that much academic studies or resources that really back them up as an effective form of teaching. But still, I think Duolingo is probably a net good for society. I'm sure that some people have learned languages from Duolingo. You can even learn Esperanto on there if you want to. I think overall, it's a pretty successful pitch. The other thing, so you don't really make that much money, but they make money. It's there. But again, something to just keep in the back of your mind. Okay, this is my favorite slide. So I want to finally talk to you a little bit about Blackboard. So most, if not everyone here, is a UCLA student. So you've used CCLE at the very least. Blackboard is like one of the first companies that made CCLE. And their version is called Blackboard Learn. Not important. Who cares? They're a for-profit educational company, and they are really big. 1 in 3 schools use Blackboard in America, and 20 million students in America use Blackboard. So that's a lot of users, right? And specifically in large schools, it's really, really popular. So 70 out of the largest 100 school districts in the US use Blackboard, which makes sense because as the bigger your school district gets, you need to manage more things, and then you get software to do it. But why did I bring up Blackboard? I brought up Blackboard, one, because it's relevant, education technology, sharing homework and quizzes online and resources is obviously important, but it's also very controversial, the company itself, right? So as I mentioned, I'm going to footnote things, and there's a slide. I have 11 articles that roast Blackboard. 2 of them are from professors, and the other 9 are from teachers. Or 8 of them are from teachers, and 1 of them is from Forbes. It's an article. But people really don't like Blackboard. And why don't they like Blackboard? Blackboard realized very early on that it had a monopoly over schools. And this is why I want to bring in a bit of economics. So I lied when I said there's no more economics. There's a principle in economics called sticky products, which means that even though you own something and it's terrible and there is a better product elsewhere, it's very hard for you to switch, right? So a classical example for us tech people is like an Apple thing, right? If you own an iPhone and AirPods and a MacBook and an iPad Pro or whatever, you're kind of in this walled garden. It's very hard for you to switch. When you switch to a Google Home, you're like, wow, this doesn't work with any of my software anymore. That's a pretty bad example in terms of the grand scheme of things. But you can think of other things too, right? If you're in the market for a job, maybe another job is a lot better for you, but quitting your job is a big risk, and you might not be willing to take on that risk in case that things don't work out properly. This is a very interesting field of economics. It's pretty cool. It's interesting to think about. If you took intro econ, you were told that people always switch whenever things are better, and clearly that's not true. But anyways, back to the point. Blackboard realized this very early on. They realized if they got school districts into their software, hey, very, very hard to switch out of the system because all of your homework, all of your quizzes, all of your teachers and classes, everything is on Blackboard. And it's very hard to switch to a different provider like Moodle or CCLE. So you're kind of just stuck. And you're stuck paying exorbitant amounts of money to Blackboard for a service that doesn't work very well because there's no competitive nature here now for Blackboard to do better. And if you don't trust just me, because I used Blackboard when I was in high school and it was terrible, you can trust all those 11 people who wrote formal articles and like the 30 others that wrote very informal articles that I couldn't cite about why Blackboard is bad. And there are a lot of other companies in this field, right? So Moodle, the one I mentioned earlier, is free and open source. And I like free and open source. But there's a bunch too. CCLE is cool because it's made in-house by people at UCLA. And you'll see splinter groups, things like Piazza, for example, that I'm sure you've used here, and things like Canvas or Power School Learning, if you did the IB, Manage Back. There are a lot of different things that do this kind of field. And you might think that all these companies means that you have tons of competition, but to some extent you don't. Because these products are so sticky, people just don't shift. It also makes it hard for new people to come into this field because you can make something that's just absolutely better than Blackboard in every way possible. But if you can't convince schools to switch off their infrastructure, it doesn't matter. And that's going to be a big lesson that we'll see in some other projects as well. But anyways, long story short, Blackboard sucks. Please read those articles. It's a fun time. Okay, so what do we talk about? I'm sure you fell asleep in the past 10 minutes. First, classroom digitization is almost everywhere now. All of us have probably used some sort of online classroom solution. And even in developing countries, I didn't mention this, but Blackboard also operates in almost every country in the world. Doesn't work very well in a lot of countries because internet access is sporadic and their service is bad. But they do. It's around. But as we saw with Blackboard, there are clashing goals between businesses and students and teachers because Blackboard doesn't really have to listen to the students to make their learning experience better because they're not selling the product to the students. And similarly, right, if you think about things like Khan Academy, right, Khan Academy doesn't have to work with the districts or the school boards to make its curriculum very good. And it does, but there's no reason for that to happen. As I mentioned with Khan Academy and Duolingo, in general, these kinds of online classrooms have been really great for improving access to education. And especially I want to point out for non-traditional students, right? If you did not graduate high school and don't have a GRE, Khan Academy is still there for you, right? If you are a veteran or something, Khan Academy is still there for you. There's no barrier to access there. And I think that's especially important because I would argue that our public school system has failed these kinds of people, right? If you dropped out of high school, it's very, very tricky for you to ever get back into that lane normally. You have to probably pay for a GED tutor or go to some other service that costs a lot of money. And Khan Academy here has really changed that game. And now they have a GED track as well. It's very exciting. If you don't know what a GED is, it's like a supplemental high school diploma if you didn't graduate from high school. And finally, there's a lot of competition in a lot of these things, right? Like I brought up those MOOCs as well. But there's oftentimes no dominant market leader. There's no Google Chrome or Google or Microsoft of these kinds of things with products that are actually amazing. And a lot of that has to do with sticky economics, at least in my opinion. I don't know. I'm just a second year. What can I say? Evan, thank you for the comment. Ash will get to your comment as well. Evan says, along the idea of sticky products, what are your thoughts on the opposite? The over-diversification of products and their usage, i.e. having to be in Piazza, CCLE, Questionsly, Gradescope, and CampusWire all in one quarter. Does this randomization hurt students' learning efficiency? Okay, so this is cool because I like your idea. And yes, there is some economic research. I want to say it's from a university in Sweden. I don't know. I read the paper maybe a year ago. But they talk about how there is software fatigue in business, right? Where if you have to use Slack and email and you text people and you have to use your CRM, that starts hurting workers' productivity. And I think it's not a far stretch to say that it also hurts students as well. So my problem is not, per se, that Blackboard offers all of these things and that's bad. My problem is that Blackboard has no incentive to improve their products because they know that people can't switch. So in an ideal world, you make all of these things very interoperable, right? I could switch from Haiku to Blackboard to CCLE in the press of a button. And in that sense, even if they still all offer all of these features like automatic grading or stuff like that, you would still have an opportunity to actually have competition in your sphere. And my big problem is that Blackboard doesn't have that. You can kind of think of this as an extension of like monopoly power. Does that kind of answer your question? I don't know. If you have more thoughts, I'm very interested to hear them. Ashvin says, what exactly does Blackboard make? So they make a suite of softwares, but you can think of it as like CCLE. So they make a software that distributes homework, that grades homework, that shows videos, creates online classes. They have a video streaming platform built in. They have analytics, so you can see which students are passing your class and which students aren't. They have a lot of these different kinds of tools. So they're supposed to be like an all-in-one solution to all of your educational needs. If that kind of answers your question. But yeah, if it didn't, drop me a message. This is basically like Twitch chat at this point. So I'm kind of excited. But yeah, broadly, what did we learn? We talked about, basically that classroom digitization is mostly going well for access, but we want to be careful of these sticky economics. Tim says Blackboard's owned by a private equity company. Yeah, I want to say they got bought out in like 09 or 11, something like that. But yeah. Private equity, that's a whole nother, I could have a passion talk on why private equity is weird. But yeah, let's talk about switch gears, maybe a little positive, less roasting. I want to talk about teaching tools now. This is cool because as it says in the marketing blurb that ACM Hack wrote, I have like a lot of experience teaching. And so I want to talk about how we can make teaching better, right? There are a few problems that I think are kind of relevant. One, resources are expensive. How can we fix that? Make them cheap or free. That's not that hard, right? Bam, print money, done. Two, lecturing is not engaging. This talk is an amazing example of why that's true. But one way that we'll see that EdTech makes lectures more engaging is with gamification. And we'll see what that looks like with big players like Minecraft in a bit. And finally, one thing is that teaching isn't personalized. Another thing that's also happening in this talk, right? I can't see what most of you guys are doing or what your thoughts are or how actually engaging this content is. And we'll see if we can create personalized metrics that make it easier for teachers to understand what's happening with their students. Okay, first I want to talk about a company that you probably haven't heard of, which is called Quill. So Quill is a startup, and their big pitch is they do algorithmic writing analysis. And that should set off a little bit of an alarm in the back of your head about bias, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But what they do is they basically provide a set of tools for teachers to automatically gauge their students' writing proficiency. So they provide a set of examples. Kids practice writing things like filling in prepositions or using the right conjugation of a verb or stuff like that. And they have a huge set of activities for kids to do. Then it uses machine learning and artificial intelligence to gauge what students' problems are. Maybe students are really bad at using the right preposition, or they're not good at using verb tenses or things like that. And it automatically provides feedback and also meta feedbacks. If their feedback's not working that well, they'll change their feedback on the fly. So very, very cool idea, actually. And they're a nonprofit. And according to their website, they have 2.7 million students across 18,000 schools, and they focus specifically on low-income schools where the teachers don't have enough resources. If you think about it, that makes sense, right? If your teachers are underfunded and they don't have that many books or writing exercises or textbooks to give out, Quill is a great alternative, right? You can just slide Quill in, the kids on their computers or on their iPads or whatever will do these writing exercises, and then hopefully they'll get better. And you reduce the need to have teachers on top of everything all the time. And you make it easier for teachers to focus on what matters, because Quill can then say, hey, this student is clearly struggling with this thing. You should intervene here. And it's used by 57,000 teachers. Again, that's from their website. So take that with a slight grain of salt. But yeah, overall, I think Quill is a great idea. Here's the thing, though. So one is, other than Quill themselves, we have very little research on how effective they are. And again, you're going to hear this a lot, but I think it's really important for us to do things like randomized controlled trials, which I realized I didn't explain. But basically, it's like a way you can perform scientific trials to reduce bias by randomly assigning things and having controls, so you can gauge how effective something is compared to not using it at all. Quill doesn't have any of those yet. It also has some not transparent things, right? If you go to ACM AI's workshops about machine learning, you'll realize that a lot of machine learning is a black box. It can't really tell you how it came to that decision. And if Quill starts penalizing writers for things that aren't actually related to writing, but are biases in these training data, like for example, like penalizing vernacular or having accent issues or things like that, then you get into a lot of problems. And historically, this has been a problem with education. This is a fun thing that I didn't include on the slide, but in California, a research team from Stanford's Institute on Poverty and Inequality did an interesting trial where they looked at who failed Spanish classes in the LA and like SF area. And they found that a lot of Mexican students failed Spanish classes. Mexico's language is Spanish. So what's going on there? Well, it turns out they would use Mexican Spanish, which is a dialect of Spanish that is spoken in Mexico. And it's similar to how American English is different from the correct version of English, which is British English. That's kind of a joke. Don't be angry at me. Mexican Spanish is different from, the Spanish that is graded in California. And that resulted in us failing a lot of kids who clearly know how to speak Spanish, can clearly communicate with other people in their community, and it penalized those people. And the reason why it did is because there was no one who was Mexican involved in the Spanish Standards Planning Committee. When you have problems like that, it's hard to not see that things like Quill could have problems. But I don't know if they do. I have never used Quill. I can't use Quill. I'm not a teacher or whatever. But just something to think about. When you create education technology, think about the biases that are inherent in your training data. And again, hit up John, hit up ACM AI to learn a bit more about that. But overall, I think Quill is a great idea. And it looks like it's working really well so far. And I don't know, I'm interested to see how it works out. Okay, next one I'll talk about is one laptop per child. This one's personal for me. So in high school, I had a great opportunity to work on this program. This program, which was started by the MIT Media Lab, one of the big players in EdTech, wanted to make computers that were $100 that you'd give to kids all over the world. They would not require internet. They could be powered by a hand crank, and they were really, really durable. So they could survive wherever they would be. And they were going to target specifically sub-Saharan Africa. This sounds amazing, right? Think about how expensive computers were. And this started in 2005. So computers at that time, laptops were $1,000, $2,000, right? And I think it was a great idea. I worked on a team in my high school that repaired these computers. And some of my friends also contribute to the open source software that runs like the OS and the interactive applications and things like that. And I will say it's an amazing idea. Why am I saying amazing idea? There are some problems in execution. It's very controversial. There's this hit piece written by someone in The Verge. You can Google it. It's also cited in a footnote here. But they ran into some production problems, right? So they realized $100 computer, not possible. So they raised it up to about $180, $200, depending on where you would buy it and exchange rates and things like that. And also they ran into problems with the computers being durable. When I repaired these computers, the screens broke all the time. And if the screen doesn't work, clearly there's a problem. But the largest problem that they faced, which is more qualitative, is that they did not really talk to the communities that they were giving these laptops to, right? And a lot of these communities said, great, these laptops are amazing, but we don't need laptops. We need teachers that show up to schools. We need the internet, right? We need electricity, we need water, we need goats, we need rice, right? We don't need this laptop, it's useless. That doesn't solve our problem. And they got a lot of backlash for that. I think this is a very important lesson just in general when you start a business, but especially with education. You need to talk to the people who you're going to sell your product to and realize if it's something that they actually need. And a lot of people did say they needed this product and that this would be very useful. But at the same time, a lot of people said it wasn't useful for them, right? That they needed something else. And that $100 could go much better towards feeding their kids or paying teachers to show up to school. The other thing I want to point out very quickly is because of that price difference, a lot of countries canceled their order. So Libya canceled a $1.1 million order of OLPCs. And part of that was because the price doubled. And part of that, I don't know if you heard in the news, but there's a war. So that wasn't that great. But yeah, a bunch of other countries pulled out as well in sub-Saharan Africa. Zimbabwe reduced their orders. Congo did as well. But also, OLPC is still really popular in other places. Uruguay, for example, piloted a 500,000 computer program, and it worked really, really well in rural communities, making sure that kids got the computer literacy that they needed. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag, right? I don't want to roast OLPC, and it's kind of close to my heart. I think it's a great idea, but there were some problems with its execution. The other legacy impact that it has is that it inspired a wave of computers targeted towards kids, right? So the EEPC is made by this Taiwanese company. Probably haven't heard of it. But then Intel made this thing called the Classmate PC, and that was the predecessor to the Chromebook. And the Chromebook is now used all over schools in the United States. And it's really cheap. It's like $300, and kids can learn on it. And the people who made the Chromebook cited OLPC and also cited the Classmate PC as one of the things that inspired them to make the product. And if you think about that, it shows that even if OLPC itself wasn't as successful as it could have been, it changed the education game forever. And identifying these kinds of problems early still has ripple effects. So it's not the worst thing in the world. And overall, I would give it like a solid thumbs up in terms of the program that it created. Wow, lots of talking. Kevin says, Matt, you're the GOAT. I love you and your biggest fan. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. Okay, oh, I skipped over the meme. I'm sorry. Sad. I want to talk about Kahoot next. I don't know if any of you played Kahoot in high school. You know, let me know in the chat if you did. I played Kahoot in high school. I really enjoyed it. But if you don't know what Kahoot is a platform where you can make basically just interactive classroom quizzes. So teachers can really easily type in just like, oh, like which of these animals is a mammal? And then they'll come up with some buttons and you'll click the responses. It's not really that hard. You could probably program Kahoot in a weekend at a hackathon. So technically, it's not a very hard thing to do. But it's just really popular. The music, as Will points out, is amazing. I love the Kahoot music. But also, it was just a really engaging tool for kids. And a lot of people have said that they've used Kahoot, which is great. But yeah, Evan brings up an interesting point, which is we're not sure how we feel about it. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But just some very brief history. It was founded by a group of people that you can see there in conjunction with the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And it actually has a strong pedagogy background. They wanted to gamify classes. They basically said, hey, kids love playing video games. I love playing video games. We want to make learning kind of like a video game. This is very, very popular. This happens outside of just Kahoot, but it's the base idea that they brought up. It's called gamification. And yeah, it looks like it's pretty successful. According to their website, over 50% of US teachers use Kahoot, which is insane. That's more market penetration than Blackboard and also iPhones. They have 3.2 billion non-unique players, which is a lot. And it's used by 97% of the Fortune 500 ? So Kahoot's not only used by just teachers and students, but they also use it in companies, which is kind of weird. I've heard my friends tell me that they've had internship onboarding that have Kahoots that say, oh, you know, like, what is this tech company's core values? And you have, you know, some responses in there. And also, similar to Khan Academy, they have a lot of papers that back this up. So because they had an academic background when they made the software, that was one of the big things that they prioritized. So there's over 15 journaled papers, so not just randomly published, but in a peer-reviewed journal that show a strong correlation with student engagement. That's pretty interesting. And it shows that Kahoot, you know, beats things like Blackboard quizzes and just talking to kids. But at the same time, I agree that we have to be a little skeptical, right? Because yeah, you know, Kahoots are very engaging, but they also disrupt the classroom dynamic and flow. I teach a class, or I used to teach a class for machine learning and AI at North Hollywood High School in a conjunction with ACM AI, actually. So very exciting stuff. And it was led by Arjun and Sharvani. They're amazing people. You have an opportunity to meet them. And sometimes we bring Kahoots into the classroom, and they were really engaging. Kids loved playing the Kahoot. But after the Kahoot, it was kind of hard to get kids back into the mood to do a lecture. And I found that even worse when I taught grade 4 kids in Toronto. So in Toronto, when I was in high school, I taught computer science and robotics to underserved kids in the Toronto area. It was a great program. I really enjoyed doing it. And it was one of my first forays into education. But we found that after Kahoot, the kids just went completely wild. And that's not great, right? That doesn't get you in the right zone for learning, and it made us waste a lot of time after the Kahoots. And eventually I just stopped doing Kahoots, and kids actually were more engaged, and we got through more of our lesson plan with that. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind. At the same time, I think overall Kahoot is an amazing tool. And another big thing is that it's free, right? You can make a Kahoot for free. And that gives teachers at least more tools in their toolkit. Even if it's not the right solution to use in every single classroom, it's still an amazing thing that you can think about using, and you can use it at the right time. So I think Kahoot is great software. Wouldn't want to roast that. Gamification is really popular outside of Kahoot. Just some examples. Minecraft has an education edition. Sweden's national government integrated Minecraft into the grade 4 and 5 learning curriculum to talk about art, creativity. Minecraft is personal for me. I learned some of the CS M51A stuff about like flip-flops and stuff by making them in Minecraft when I was a lot younger. It's really, really fun. Would recommend. And there are things like Class Dojo and Classcraft that directly gamify the learning process. You do quizzes, you level up your character, you get points, you can buy things for your character and stuff like that. Basically like RuneScape, but for learning, or Animal Crossing, but for learning. And Lego is really involved in the education sphere. They spend a lot of money into creating things like Mindstorms, like Lego robots, but also in their learning through play initiative. And gamification is a really big space in EdTech. Okay, oof, halfway done the case studies. Thank you for not leaving me just yet. But what did we talk about in sum, in case you slept through that as well? First, gamification is a very driving force, as I just talked about, but we need a lot more data, right? Kahoot is that golden example where they have research papers, but things like Classcraft and Class Dojo just don't have any at all that back them up. And we need more data on how gimmicky they are and how well they actually work, right? In addition, as I mentioned with Quill, machine learning and AI are becoming more and more popular to supplement or replace teachers. And to some extent, that's great because teachers are already not paid enough. School districts can't afford to hire more teachers, and there aren't enough people going to teachers' college. But at the same time, we need to be careful about things like biases and how well these softwares actually work. Cost is a big barrier, so we should just make things free. Kahoot has a freemium model. Quill has a freemium model. All these kinds of different models make it easier for things to happen. But also, as we noticed, changes in cost are a big deal, right? OLPC less than doubled the cost of their laptop, which in economics terms is actually not that big of a deal. And they lost, millions and millions of orders. And so that shows that even though things are sticky, price actually matters a lot in education because there's not that much money comparatively in the game. And finally, first mover advantage is pretty big, but that just basically means if you're the first person to do something, it's really great. Because a lot of people made their own version of Kahoot, but Kahoot's still around. And part of that is because the music is a bop. But also part of that is because, as we mentioned earlier, there's sticky economics involved, right? If you're used to using Kahoot and you've used Kahoot all that time, even if there is a better Kahoot, you're probably not going to switch to it. And so it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Cool. Okay. Talk about teaching tech and CS for a bit. This is the thing that I have the most experience in. So as Eugene and the ACM hack team mentioned, I've taught actually some sort of tech or CS for the past 7 years of my life. So in high school, I taught a lot of Scratch, which was really fun. I love teaching Scratch with kids, and robotics programming, and I did a bit of Python, but that was a lot hard to get kids engaged in. And then now with ACM Teach LA, quick plug, quick shout out, we do a lot of different kinds of teaching, and I teach an AI and machine learning course at North Hollywood High School. But what are the problems that we have? So first is that good CS teachers are really rare, right? Just think about this comparative for a moment. So, you could work at Google, get paid over 100K a year, and they give you free food. Or you could be a teacher, have to go to 2 extra years of teacher college, get significantly underpaid, everyone hates you, you have to buy supplies for your own kids, and the kids are really mean. Maybe that last part is just from my experience, but everything else is true for a lot of different kinds of teachers. And it's really hard to get good CS teachers. So how can we solve that problem? One is a policy change, but can't really do that in EdTech. So we can make learning more hands-off, makes that you need less good trained CS teachers and focus more on providing kids with education. Another thing is that tech is expensive, money rules the world. And so we want to make low cost or open sourced technology. And the examples I'll talk about are all open source. And finally, one problem is that CS evolves too quickly, right? So, when I first got into CS, I'm really lucky. I got into it when I was a lot younger. Macromedia Flash was the new big thing. And so I made games with Flash. And I uploaded them to like Miniclip and Newgrounds. And the people there were like, Matt, these games are absolutely trash. And they were pretty bad. That was kind of discouraging. But now no one makes games in Flash, right? And those skills weren't really transferable. And actually, to be honest, I don't really know how to make games anymore in Unity or stuff like that to the same extent that I did. So we want to make sure that the skills that we teach are always there, that it's not just reliant on the hot language of the week or the hot framework of the year, because those skills might evaporate. The way we do that is with a platform agnostic environment. What does that mean? Let's find out. So first, let's talk about Scratch. I love Scratch. If you don't know what Scratch is this like programming suite that basically teaches or lets kids like write computer science programs, but without typing code. Instead of writing code, you have these like drag and drop blocks, and you bop them around, and they have like for loops and while loops and if statements and variables, and they have all the things that you would learn in CS31, but no coding. And the reason they did that is because they want to remove the barrier that coding has on learning. Because really the fundamental thing is how to think like a computer, how to program imperatively, and all these kinds of things. It's not really about, semicolons and if they're optional or not in JavaScript, which is, by the way, a strange design choice. And it's pretty solid. It's made by the MIT Media Lab, so the same people who made OLPC. And it's a nonprofit, as all the MIT Media Lab things are. And I think they've done a great job. So if you look at the stats and metrics from their website, they have over 40 million users, and it's translated in 50 languages. It's used by every country in the world. And they have 7 NSF, which is the National Science Foundation grants. So they're deemed important enough by the American government that they deserve money to continue their mission in terms of education. And they're cited in over 30 papers in terms of education papers about how to teach effectively, but also CS papers about open source technology. I would encourage you to click the footnote and learn more information once we post the link for the slides, I guess. And yeah, it's really effective. Personally, I've taught with it now for 7 years in some way, shape, or form. So I think I've used it quite a bit, and I really enjoy how it takes away the daunting part of programming. I think it improves access, one, because it's free and open source, so you can learn programming no matter how much money you have, and no matter how potato your computer is. It runs on very bad computers. But 2, it changes pedagogy, right? It makes coding not about learning a language. And that's really important too, because that's the key thing that we talked about earlier, right? If you learn for loops in Scratch, sure, you don't know how to write a for loop in Python, but maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll all be using Zig or Go or Haskell or, I don't know, Rust or something like that, right? So, but you'll know how a for loop works, which is the important thing. And when you go to high school and you take APCS and you probably learn Java, or you go to university and you learn C++ for the Smallberg, you still retain that knowledge, and that's critical. No matter how these languages evolve, until we move to functional programming only, Scratch is really, really useful. And I think that's a very important part of what they've done. I'm just curious if anyone has used Scratch or learned CS through Scratch. If you do, drop a comment. But I really love Scratch. I think it's a great example of EdTech done right. I will say it's a very technically hard program to implement. They hired a bunch of really, really good software development engineers. But I think it's a great, great program. It's an example of really, really good EdTech, I think. Almost nothing to say wrong about Scratch. Only thing is the funding thing. How do they make money? They have a foundation, they're endowed, Google donates money, Facebook donates money, every big CS player donates money. And the reason why they do that is because it produces good engineers. And that's really important for those companies, and it makes them money. So it's kind of a win-win. A lot of people have said that they've used Scratch. I appreciate that. I love Scratch. Scratch is great. The other thing I want to talk about is Arduino. Taking Physics 4AL, this is kind of like a flashback for you. But Arduino, if you're not familiar, is actually, okay, this is kind of interesting. When we say Arduino, we usually mean Arduino, the little microcontroller board. And that's like basically parts of a small computer that you can program and attach electric stuff to and attach sensors and modules and stuff like that. The reason why I say widely debated in that slide is because turns out there's 2 companies called Arduino, or there used to be 2 companies called Arduino, and the guy who made Arduino in his master's thesis paper got it stolen from him by his PhD advisor, and they made a company without him. It's a whole thing. It's very, very interesting. Not important for this presentation though, but Arduino in general is actually an open sourced microcontroller plan. So they sell these little chip thingies, but they also put them public for anyone to make. And that's why online, if you look up Arduinos, you can buy Arduinos from a crap load of people. So why is that important, right? First, before Arduino came around, these kinds of microcontrollers were very expensive. They cost $100 to $200. Don't have a source for that because that's just me anecdotally saying that, but I looked into it when I was a lot younger and I couldn't buy them. Yeah, that's not very accessible, right? It makes it hard for you to get into learning hardware. But now that Arduinos are open source, you have tons of producers competing against each other to produce them for the lowest price possible, to make them the most accessible. And now you can buy Arduino microcontrollers that are $20 to $40, which is kind of insane. And that makes it easier, for example, if you're a school, to buy some for your class, which UCLA should do for Physics 4AL. But also, it makes it easier for underfunded schools to provide these kinds of resources to their students. It also means it's easier to teach with these things, right? Because now you have all these schematics, you can add on your own sensors or modules. It creates an entire community around what you do. If you look at Arduinos now, there's tons of people who use them for lots of different things. You go to hackathons, people use them to make, smart locks, right? Or temperature sensors, so all these different kinds of things. But also people use them professionally to prototype out microcontroller boards and PCBs and stuff like that. So there's a lot of wide-ranging use. So overall, it's an interesting thing to think about. Also kind of unfeasible for like college students to make it a hackathon because you need to have lots of industrial things. But I think CS and tech is not just about software. And Arduino is an example of at least an approach system that has changed how we teach CS. And now Arduinos are used in classrooms all over the world. And I actually taught kids how to use Arduinos to make robots in high school in Toronto, which is kind of insane because these kids were in grade 4 and 5. They have no idea what a microcontroller is, but somehow we got all to work together and it worked out. So exciting stuff, Arduinos. Anyways, there are a lot of other examples that I don't really have that much time to talk about because y'all might get bored. But here are some examples. You can look them up in your own time. I want to just point out GitHub. I love GitHub. GitHub is an amazing company. GitHub is not just cheating in your CS classes. GitHub is a lot more than that. And you have a lot of opportunities to learn on GitHub. People post lesson plans and those things like GitHub Classroom. It's very cool. I'd recommend you check it out when you have the time. But yeah, there's a lot of people involved in tech and CS. So what did we learn from that part of the presentation? One, these platform agnostic and open source solutions have the most staying power. So Scratch and Arduino have been around for 15 years. And the reason why is because Scratch is open source. Anyone can contribute to it. And so, lots of people add on things that they want to see. They also are platform agnostic. You don't have to code in C. You don't have to code in, languages that people used to use for teaching, like Pascal or Julia. You just code in the visual programming language and it works out. Similarly, Arduino has staying power over other microcontroller competitions because anyone can make them, and there are just so many of them all around the world. Still though, teaching tech requires qualified teachers. And I didn't really talk about this in either of those examples, but think about the experiences that I dwelt on, right? I was lucky enough that I know how Scratch works and I've used it for a long time. And I've used Arduinos before, and so I could teach them. But a lot of high school teachers don't. I've had high school teachers ask me when I was in Toronto to teach those classes for them because admittedly, these are very hard concepts to learn. If you don't program or don't use Arduinos, you have no idea what's going on. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind, that when you make these kinds of technologies, you want to make them easy to use. Scratch has done a great job with this. They publish these curriculum plans that you can just download and read through. They require no previous CS experience, and they teach you how to teach lessons about Scratch. Arduino also has lots of learning guidelines and stuff like that too. Hardware is expensive. Money, money always matters. And so competition is what drives down costs, which is what I mentioned with that Arduino stuff. And we'll see that one more time in our next category. And finally, I think this is just kind of a nice thing to think about. CS becomes easier to learn, right? A lot of us, I think, are in our late teens or early 20s. And so we kind of grew up with the internet or grew up right before the internet really blew up. Some kids now, and the kids that I work with now, have never realized a world without the internet. And they have all these tools that are designed to help them succeed in computer science. I think that's amazing. And a lot of that happens because we have, big players like Google and Microsoft sort of investing in these kinds of tools. But it's great. CS is a lot easier to learn, right? Scratch wasn't really big when I started programming, but now it is, and that makes it a lot easier. And as I think time goes on, it'll become even easier, maybe because of the contributions that you all make to EdTech. Or not, don't worry about it. Okay, cool. Almost done, I promise. Then you'll never have to talk to me again. And I think that'll be a win-win. Let's talk about closing inequality gaps. I think this is the most serious problem. I'm going to be straightforward with you. None of the solutions I provided are a silver bullet that solve education inequality. I think this is a problem that is much larger than just what tech can do. But I want to highlight some situations that tech has become useful and how you can be a part of that if that's something you're interested in. To me, there are two key problems that we have with education. One is that's distributed inequally. So locally, like in LA, and globally, as in countries and stuff like that. And we can solve that by promoting access, so like making it easier for people to get access to education, both digitally and also culturally. I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But also, there are systemic barriers to education. No matter how much education you hand out to people, people are going to be incentivized maybe to not take it, right? And this is probably the most prevalent in the public eye with girls and STEM, right? Especially since a lot of us are CS majors. There are a lot of barriers because people say, oh, coding is not for girls. I think that's just straight up bullshit. Oops, sorry, PG-13. But It's true. There are systemic barriers in access to kinds of education. And if you look past just girls in STEM, in some countries in the world, people just believe that girls like shouldn't go to school at all, or they don't deserve opportunities to get education. I think these are also equally problematic. And we'll talk about how we can fight that and deconstruct barriers to that kind of education with tech. Cool. Cool. As another heads up, I guess this is slightly political, but sometimes you need some politics. I want to talk first about an organization that you've never heard of in a country that you might not know where it is on the map, which is Making Ghanaian Girls Great, or MG Cubed, as it's affectionately called. So MG Cubed is a charity backed by the Varkey Foundation, which is just like a private foundation that funds educational ventures. And specifically, as the name implies, they focus on empowering girls in Ghana, specifically in rural and poor areas of Ghana. Why is this a problem? So first, very quickly, there's some misconceptions that like all of sub-Saharan Africa is just completely underdeveloped, which is actually not true. A lot of city centers in Africa are very, very well developed. If you look at, for example, South Africa, they have vibrant tech hubs all over the place. In Nigeria, for example, they have millions and millions of dollars of VC funding coming in from China and America, building up companies there. But where a lot of this development has really lacked is in rural areas. And specifically in rural Ghana, girls have like something like a 10% access rate to education, which is very, very low, right? I think that's just terrible. Like obviously, I think girls should have access to primary education the same way that everyone should have access to primary education. So how does MG Cubed solve that problem? They do two things. The tech-related thing they do is with satellite-enabled distance learning. So that's a buzzword, but what that means is that these rural communities don't have internet. They don't have like broadband wired internet. So things like OLPC might not be that helpful for them. So they pay for satellite internet for remote classes in Ghana, which is kind of exciting. And they make sure that kids still get access to things like Wikipedia or online tutorials at a subsidized or low cost. But they also do things outside of just tech, right? So one problem that you'll find in most developing countries is teacher absenteeism, which is that teachers just don't show up to school. If you're interested more in that, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, the people who won the 2019 Economics Nobel Prize, have a very cool set of RCTs about teacher absenteeism. But basically, the bottom line is that teachers just don't show up. So MG Cubed pays teachers to show up. And they also have volunteer teachers who go to classes, and specifically teachers that work with girls. And the reason why they do this is because in a lot of these areas, they have found that girls are historically underserved by teachers. So not only are teachers not showing up, but teachers will often tell girls, hey, you can't get involved with education. This isn't really for you. Okay, cool. That was a lot of blabbering about the situation, but what have they done? In the past 3 years, they've impacted 36,000 pupils, 88 schools. That's a lot of people. I think that's a great thing to have done. And they've increased a lot of metrics that make it very proven that girls have improved. So in an RCT, which is linked in that footnote, they have mentioned they've improved girls' English fluency by 30 to 35% compared to the control, which is the average thing with no intervention. That's really important because English fluency is linked with things like contraceptive use, birth rates, not dying, getting a job, all these very important things I think some of us take for granted sometimes. So MG Cubed has done a lot of work there. And they're backed by some big players, the Department for International Development in the US and the UK Department of Aid. There's a lot of words that just came out of me, but what's the big lesson here? One, we've never heard of this problem, or we've never heard of this company, and we probably haven't heard about this problem. In the grand scheme of things, there are a lot of different problems that people face all over the world. And it's interesting for us to think about these problems and why they might be different. Because to us, I don't think satellite distance learning is something that I've ever had to think about in my life. But it is a problem for a lot of other people. Secondly, one of the things that the Varkey Foundation did right is they reached out to local leaders in these rural towns. And that's really important because they worked with the people that they were working with. Versus, as I mentioned earlier with OLPC, there were some problems where they just didn't interact with their customers and ask them what they needed. And when they realized, for example, that one problem was that it's not that all these villages just hated women and didn't want them to develop, but they realized that, for example, they thought that women needed to stay home and take care of their family. They mentioned how going to school actually makes it easier for women to provide for their family, which seems kind of intuitive for us, but it is still important to drive home. These kinds of approaches are really, really important, especially when you think about developing countries and global aid. But yeah, MG Cubed, very cool. There's a report about MG Cubed by this accelerator, 100 Ed. We'll talk about that later. Okay, for something maybe closer to home and something that a lot of us might have heard about, and I'm curious if you've heard about Girls Who Code and or used like their resources. comment in the chat. I'm very curious actually about that. But Girls Who Code is a US-based nonprofit that wants to close the tech gender gap at a young age. We got a yeet out of Eugene. Thank you, I appreciate that. And what do? The big thing they do is they create these clubs to tell girls that, hey, there are a lot of barriers that you face in technology, but we're here to help. They provide professional development counseling, technical workshops, and also just mentors and partners, right? They have college alumni people who say, hey, you want to go to CS and tech? This is what that might look like for you. And they focus on changing that perception both for girls and combating that internalized sexism, but also impacting and through advocacy work, changing policies across the United States. They have a lot of really nice statistics about them. This is from their 2019 annual report. They've reached 300,000 girls in 8,500 clubs in the US. They raised over $100 million, which is a lot of money. And over half of the girls that they work with are historically underrepresented in tech. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's not related to technology at all, which is intersectionalism, right? If you've heard of that term before, basically the idea is that, if you are a girl in tech, you probably face some barriers to getting whatever you want to do in life. Similarly, if you're from a racial minority, or you are gay or transgender, you also face many other problems. And it turns out these problems overlap, or they have an intersection. And so looking at all the different kinds of ways that people are affected by things like sexism and like racism fundamentally change how we work with these kids. To some of you, that's like not a new topic at all. You're like, wow, Matt, that was really, really easy. But I think it's something that's really important to think about, right? The intersectionalism matters. And Girls Who Code places a lot of importance on that, especially with young Black girls and Latina girls who statistically do not enter CS at all, right? In their annual report, they mentioned that before Girls Who Code started, I think it's something along the lines of like 1% or less of Black girls consider computer science as a viable career option for them. And I think that's tragic because I don't think your race or your gender affects how good of a coder you can be. Overall, Girls Who Code seems like an amazing organization. And I think they're a very interesting work to follow in the future and see what they do. Cool. Okay, this is another software that you probably have never heard of. So this is called Nvda, and it's a screen reader. So if you don't know what a screen reader is, basically, if you're visually impaired, as you can imagine, it's very hard to use websites because you can't see what's on the website. And so a screen reader goes through the website's HTML and reads to a person who may be blind or visually impaired what's on the screen. You need to code your website to like make it easy for screen readers to use. That's something I do a lot at TeachLA. But in general, it sounds like a pretty easy thing to do, right? No, absolutely not. This is like so hard to do as software. And as a result, most screen readers cost a load of money. But two guys, Michael Karan and James Teh, said, hey, that's ridiculous. If I'm blind, I shouldn't have to pay money to use the internet like the rest of the world. And so they made their own open source and free screen reader called Nvda. I think this is nuts. And here's the thing, you probably, unless you're visually impaired or know someone who is, probably don't think about visually impaired students that often. But they're a really historically underserved group, right? All these EdTech innovations I just talked to you about require you to see what's on a website. If you can't do that, that's a fundamental barrier to the education that you receive. So I think Nvda has done a great job there. They're the only big free and open source one. The other ones cost upwards of thousands of dollars to get. I think it's very unfair to force blind people to pay thousands of dollars to gain the same kind of education, especially if they also are already in an underfunded school district. Some usage metrics, they are translated in 55 languages, so they can read to you in 55 languages, and it's used in almost every country in the world. They have over 70,000 users. It doesn't sound like a lot, but I think that is a big deal, especially when you think of how many visually impaired people there are in the United States. And they support a lot of things, right? So they support browsers, as I mentioned, but they can also do PowerPoint slides like this one. They can read math, which I think is really cool. So, if you get math homework from your teacher and it's written in LaTeX, which you can learn about at ACM Hacks Tooling Series Workshop, you can read that. So, you're not gating visually impaired people out of learning math either. And that's something that many other screen readers don't do. They can also do things like email clients, and you can even control Spotify with Nvda, which is, I think, also pretty cool. So overall, this is a big deal. And I think it's really important for us to talk about this because people don't talk about it. Most of the time, I think people's attitudes with EdTech and tech in general is, I'm going to solve problems that I face. And that's a great attitude to have because that means that you can solve problems that you see every day. But sometimes it's not just about problems that you face. And if the problem is not very common, maybe no one's going to solve that problem. I think that's kind of tragic. So it's important for us to say, hey, Are there problems that other people are facing that we can solve? And Nvda is by no means an easy thing to do to come up with at a hackathon. But at the same time, it solves a crucial problem. And it was just 2 people working on this software. And yet it's blown up and become so big. Okay, almost done. Almost done. Last one I'll talk about, this is very quick, is Exception Ally. It's not exceptionally. This was like a nightmare to Google. But they're a very new startup. They are Y Combinator batch 2018, so 2 years ago. And their pitch is they want to help parents of special needs children with something that's called child advocacy. So if you're not very familiar with special needs education systems in America, there's this thing called an IED, an individual education plan, basically, that basically just explains what kind of services your kid is going to get. If they had, for example, ADHD or dyslexia or Down syndrome. This is depressingly bad in the sense that 2/3 of special needs students just are taught by unqualified teachers. So that in itself is pretty bad. That's footnoted from like, I think it's number 5 or number 6 in one of the previous slides. But it's also just very hard to navigate. There's tons of paperwork you need to fill out. And these words are very confusing. And even I don't fully understand what an IED actually is and how you navigate that. So this is a startup that they want to just make it easy for parents to do it. They use just automated stuff to tell you how your kid is doing. They corroborate a bunch of different sources together and things like that. So again, point out here, just got to think about problems that maybe you're not having, but other people do. And the service that they provide is not technically the most insane thing in the world, but it seems like it's very good and it helps out a lot of people. That being said, it's very new. I have no stats or metrics. There are no academic papers that back it up. But I'm interested to see how this company works in the future. Okay, cool. We did a team. We're done the case studies. What were our key takeaways? First, with developing countries, tech can be very useful, but you need to consult the people who live there. I think that's just, I've been hammering that home quite a bit. Secondly, as I mentioned with Girls Who Code, CS and tech is still an unwelcoming field, right? We just talked about girls in coding, but there are also many, many other problems, right? Like, for example, homophobia in tech, transphobia in tech. And we need to think about that, as a lot of us are CS majors. Whew. And when we move towards disadvantaged and minority groups, we can find that businesses overlook them because there's no profit motive, right? So with the screen reader stuff, because there aren't that many visually impaired people in the world, it doesn't financially make sense for Google to jump in and make a screen reader. They're not going to make that much money off of it, and it's not going to get them ads. But small teams like people at UCLA, could be part of making that difference. And finally, I've mentioned this a few times, free and open source, it's pretty lit. You should do it. Nvda, for example, is run by those 2 guys, but they have a full open source community that translates all of their things and things like that. Yeah, so I know, Google has an open source screen reader, Chromebox and Chrome OS. Yeah, so I've heard of that. I used it once for an accessibility rig test, but that's pretty recent. So recently, screen readers have become way more popular, especially with like HTML5, semantic, like area, stuff like that. But I think Nvda came out in 2005 or 6, I want to say, something along that timeline. And definitely, though, I think companies now are making a lot of steps forward. But still just something to think about. There are other problems too that a lot of people face, and you can kind of solve those with tech. But yeah, screen readers, I think also, just very quickly, not really relevant to the talk, but if you are a web developer in any way, shape, or form, you should look into how screen readers work and accessibility measures, right? Things like color contrast or text font sizes, or like how well-used semantic elements are really important for people who use screen readers. And if you never use one, you might just not know that there's a gaping problem in your software. Anyways, besides the point. I'm sure Tim can also tell you way more about that than I can. But yeah, very quickly, other companies that I didn't mention that are like, were kind of cool, but we're running out of time. Gradescope, a lot of you probably use Gradescope now. They're pretty new. I think they're a pretty cool service. It works pretty well. Another personal favorite is Wolfram Alpha. Dude, Wolfram Alpha is sick. They have so much cool math stuff. I love Wolfram Alpha. And things like Wikipedia, like I think people take Wikipedia not very, like they take it for granted, like I donate to Wikipedia. They provide so much knowledge for free. It's insane. And like before Wikipedia, you'd have to go to a library or pay for books. I can't imagine having to do that now. And there's a smattering of other companies. You can look them up if you're interested. But yeah, okay. Let's wrap this up. It's been a long time. I'm sure you all want to do other things with your lives other than listen to me talk for another 30 minutes. So what did we learn? There are some benefits you get out of EdTech. It increases access because you can learn anywhere in the world at any time. And free online resources make it easier for you to learn things when you otherwise can't. We've talked about how tech can make personalized and engaged learning through things like Quill or Khan Academy. And sometimes technology looks to replace teachers entirely out of the loop, like Quill. And we talked about organization. Software just automates things so that teachers can focus more on important things. And sometimes they can just make it easier for people to process and distribute information, things like Blackboard, begrudgingly, or things like Exception Ally. But at the same time, it's not all rosy. There's still some problems that you have. So for example, EdTech requires computers and internet access. And if you don't have the internet, none of these things have any impact with the way that you learn. So you rely on that. And a lack of tech literacy makes these solutions hard. So at ACM Teach LA, we teach a lot of schools. And one of the schools we teach at is Sepulveda Middle School. And we teach a Python class there. And I think Python's a pretty cool thing to teach. But our instructors found that there was a problem. And the problem was that a lot of the kids did not know how to type. So it makes things like asking kids to go through worksheets or type through a lot of stuff very tricky. And no matter how good your online IDE or Code Academy or whatever is, if the kids can't use the technology because they're not used to it, it's useless. And so tech literacy is actually a big barrier to using EdTech. And it's more pronounced in places where people don't grow up with computers at all. A lot of words. Pedagogy, one, EdTech doesn't work with teachers. A lot of these things are done without the consultation of teachers. I think that's bad. You can't just like conjure something up and expect teachers to use it. And two, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lack of rigorous academic analysis on EdTech, right? So we're not really studying how effective these things are. And I think it's important for us to do that so we can gauge what's good and what's not. Organization, a lot of EdTech is still bureaucracy. If you've managed a class on CCLE or Blackboard, there's like tons of options, of stuff that you can toggle on or off. And it's ridiculous that companies pay for Blackboard coaches so that they can teach you how to use Blackboard, because that's, in my opinion, a waste of money. Maybe a better design could have been done there. And as I've mentioned, profit motives often compete against educational goals, right? So you need to make money to pay your employees, obviously. But the way you make money can impact how easy people get access to your thing or how competitive your thing is, again, like Blackboard. And so it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Also, more broadly, EdTech is not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all of these problems, right? I'm not really going to go through those things on the slide because I want to change how I talk about this, but there are just big problems that EdTech doesn't solve. Fundamentally, no startup is going to change how girls are viewed with STEM. That's just it. That requires a much larger cultural change in society. No wonderful startup is going to automatically make homophobia disappear, right? No startup is going to automatically fix a lack of infrastructure, internet infrastructure in places like Ghana. You can make incremental steps, but you need other things too. In particular, this is just a very quick paraphrase of what Bill Gates has said before. You need to have governments work with you to do big policy changes, and you need big funding players. And the reason why you need those things is because people sometimes trust their government, and people definitely trust money. And if you don't have those things on your side and they're working against you, no matter how much work you do, you're not going to be able to make the large-scale change that really impacts education. But broadly, there's a lot of change. It needs to be systemic. And one startup's not going to change the game, but it makes incremental steps. Things like OLPC are one step in a larger puzzle of granting access to these students. So I think the change can also include you. So let's wrap this up with more of a positive note, right? Who's in the fight and how can you get involved? And maybe fight is a little bit of an unfair term. There's government and quasi-governmental orgs. So that's things like the Department of Education, which hires teachers. And also things like UNICEF or UNESCO, which are UN bodies that are specifically focused towards education and kids' education. UNICEF especially is a really big player in this field. They fund a lot of things. And people joke about the UN doing nothing, but I think UNICEF is actually probably the branch of the UN that does the most. Don't tell the other branches of the UN that I said that. There are NGOs that do advocacy and executions. For example, Teach for America, they have a chapter at UCLA, is a nonprofit that trains teachers and does volunteer teaching. It's very cool. You should check into it. They also do advocacy work as well to promote like teacher well-being in the United States. I cited a lot of sources from the Opportunity Institute. They're a nonprofit think tank that focuses on education as a mean for opportunity, and they have all kinds of economists there, so they're kind of boring, but you can check them out too. And there's a lot of funding and capital into NGOs, right? So there's this guy, Bill Gates, not sure if you guys have heard of him, but he's a pretty big deal. And he has a wife, Melinda Gates, also pretty big deal. They're both pretty big people. And they have this foundation. Don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They donate tons of money towards education and also things like almost single-handedly wiping out malaria. Maybe not single-handedly, but they were a big part of that international push to wipe out malaria. And there is this person, Priscilla Chan, and her husband, I don't know what her husband does. He does stuff. But they have this thing called the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is a nonprofit funding source, basically, like a charity to some extent, that works with partners to create innovative educational solutions. And there are some people at UCLA who are working at CZI in the future, so you should hit them up. There are a lot of sources like this that exist and make education easier for you. But also, I think the big thing is that there are teachers and students. Those are the people who really get involved. And that really is you. Look at all those cute animations of kids that I've reused throughout the entire presentation. But what does that look like, right? So this is an ACM hack event. So let's talk about hacking for a bit. There are a lot of hackathons and things like that that are focused around education. I know LA Hacks, for example, and Queer Hacks at UCLA both had education-themed prizes and tracks. And there are a lot of things that you can make that can fundamentally change education. Think about things like Quizlet, for example, that Evan mentioned. Quizlet is not a very hard app to implement, right? It's just online flashcards. And yet they have a large-scale impact. Same thing with things like Kahoot, right? Or even to some extent like Khan Academy, because you're just uploading videos. These kinds of things are definitely doable. And if you see a problem that you're like, man, I hate this as a student, you could be part of the solution. You can make these kinds of things, right? This is maybe a bit of a plug, but teaching, right? I don't know. I mean, if you have a lot of knowledge and you want to share the knowledge, I think teaching is a great way to do it. It's probably the best way to do it. And there are a lot of ways you can get involved in teaching. You can join a lot of nonprofit student orgs. I heard Teach LA is not bad. I heard Beam is not bad. I heard there's a lot of other clubs as well. But it's an opportunity for you to give back to the community. And since we lack a lot of teachers, especially in fields like CS, this is an opportunity for you to do that. And past that, volunteering, right? You don't have to work with kids if you don't like working with kids, but in general, making an impact in your community is important, and that fundamentally changes things, even if it's not directly related to education, right? Because if you, for example, volunteer at a soup kitchen, right? You probably are filling some kids' bellies who then can focus on school. And something that you'll see is that all of these things are kind of connected together. And then like the longer ones, one is like talking to your community, right? When we talked about screen readers, I have not thought about screen readers for a long time. And then I met one of the people in my school who was visually impaired. And he was like, Matt, your website sucks. I can't view it on my screen reader. And that was a big wake-up call for me to think about that problem. If you talk to the community around you, you'll probably find tons of different kinds of problems that you can look to solve. This one's the classic. You should vote. Voting is good. Young people don't vote enough. Vote with your head. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but think about the problems that you face that there are in education. Look at people's platforms and see how voting for different people is going to change that. And finally, last but not least, please be a nice person. You know, be nice to your teachers. Be nice to other students. Don't gate people out of tech because they haven't programmed in 10 different languages or because they don't fit your view of an ideal programmer. As much as we all dislike some professors at UCLA, don't be too mean to them. I mean, they've dedicated part of their life to teaching you, right? And if you have siblings or if you eventually have kids who go to teachers, try not to get too angry at them. Maybe they're not the world's best teacher, but they're probably not working with as much support as they could use. At the end of the day, I think being nice to people goes a lot more than you might think. Okay. Probably some of you are like, thank God. 7:38. This man has been talking for so long. But I want to say thank you for coming to this ACM Hack Passion Talk. It was the first one. I really appreciate all of you for sticking around. There are a lot of references and footnotes. I'm just going to tab through them. We'll post the slides. Look, I did the citing thingy. Look at that. Wow, very exciting. This one was very fun. This page is just articles that rose Blackboard. You should definitely check that one out. And again, more references and footnotes. Where's the Kahoot for the talk? Dude, I should have done a Kahoot. That's actually, oh, wow. That's a really missed moment. Man, I really could have done that. But yeah, and then I'll hand it off to Eugene. He'll mention the feedback form and talk to you guys about next steps.
I'm going to reflect it to Asha.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate having you. Before you guys go, please fill out our feedback form. It'll be really helpful for all of our future Passion Talks. We will be having a couple more. Our next one is next week, so you guys should come and check that out too.
Yeah, and I guess we'll leave this up for a bit. Again, would really appreciate your feedback. As it says, please check my ego. And I'll stick around for a bit until 8. That's when I'm booked. So if you want to ask questions or talk about some EdTech stuff, I'd be glad to do that. And I think we'll stop the recording soon, I guess, per se, so we don't like record other people. But yeah, I really appreciate all of you for coming. Thank you for listening to me talk about EdTech. Hopefully this has motivated you to do something and change the game. But even if it hasn't, I don't know, just interesting stuff to think about. So thanks a lot for coming. Really appreciate it. What if I make a Kahoot like right now? Thanks for coming, everyone. See you, Leo. Tim says, if anything, Matt